All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today we're getting into something pretty fascinating, I think, this idea of social presence, that feeling of actually being there with others, but in an online learning space.
Yeah, it's all about those synchronous virtual learning environments, or CVEs, as the researchers call them.
Right, CVEs, exactly. And we've got a whole stack of research here looking at how that feeling of being present with others actually changes how we learn and how we interact with each other when we're learning online.
And we really want to help you get a good grasp on this topic, in a way that's both clear and insightful, I guess.
Exactly. We know you're all busy people, so we're going to do our best to kind of cut through the jargon and give you those key takeaways, those nuggets of wisdom.
Definitely. And I think it's important to point out that we're specifically focusing on desktop CVEs today.
Right. Good point.
So we're talking about those virtual environments you access through your computer monitor, where you're represented by an avatar. Think platforms like Second Life or Active Worlds or even Vitero.
Yeah, so not the really immersive stuff you get with the head-mounted displays.
Oh, no, not
This
that.
is more your everyday kind of virtual learning setup.
Right.
So the big question we're going to try and unpack today is this. How do those nonverbal signals that our avatars display in these desktop CVEs actually influence that feeling of social presence?
And what does all of that mean for learning, right? Like, does it actually make a difference in how we learn?
Exactly. And we're going to be looking at a pretty good range of research on this, from some of those early exploratory studies to some more controlled experiments, including some really interesting work done by you.
Yeah, I've been fortunate enough to do some research in this area.
So let's get into it then. First things first. Why should we care about this whole social presence thing anyway? What's the big deal about feeling present with others when we're learning online?
Well, I mean, at its core, social presence is really just that feeling of being with another person, even if it is in a virtual space.
Right. It's that feeling of connection, even when you're not physically in the same room.
Exactly. And it
Mhm.
turns out it's actually a pretty critical factor for successful online teaching and learning. It's a key social ingredient, you could say.
Because if you're not feeling connected to the other people in the virtual classroom, it can really make the whole learning experience less effective, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It can really impact how much you get out of it.
It's more than just passively absorbing information, isn't it? It's about
Well,
actively engaging with the material, with the instructor, with the other learners.
right. It's about interaction and participation.
And that sense of social presence can really boost motivation too, don't you think?
Oh, for sure. If you feel like you're part of a group, part of a community, even if it's online, you're more likely to stay motivated and keep learning.
Definitely. And it also shapes how we interact with each other when we're trying to learn together, right? Like for me, those real light bulb moments, those aha moments, often come when I'm bouncing ideas off someone else or when I feel like we're all kind of tackling a problem together, as a team.
Yeah, I totally get that. A stronger sense of social presence, it really helps create a more engaging and ultimately more productive learning environment. It's what helps foster those interactions, that shared understanding that's so important for deep learning.
So we know nonverbal communication is it's huge in face-to-face settings, right? Like we're constantly picking up on these subtle cues from each other, like facial expressions, body language, tone of voice. They all help the conversation flow smoothly. They give us feedback on whether we're being understood, and they even help us grasp complex ideas sometimes. Like if someone's using their hands to illustrate a point while they're talking.
Right. It's like those nonverbal cues are adding an extra layer of meaning to what's being said.
Exactly. And of course, nonverbal communication is essential for expressing emotions and attitudes too. So, how does all of that translate into the online world when we're interacting through avatars?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It
It's like, how
is.
do we create that same sense of presence, that same richness of communication when we're not physically there?
And the research suggests that even though the way we communicate might be different in online environments compared to face, the underlying purpose of those digital nonverbal signals is similar, right?
Yeah, that's the idea. Researchers believe these online cues are still influencing things like turn-taking in a conversation,
Hmm.
the feedback we give each other, even that cognitive support you were talking about, like maybe an avatar pointing to something on a shared screen. And they're even shaping how we communicate and interpret emotions, even if it's all happening through these digital representations of ourselves.
So it's like, even if it's a digital nod or a virtual thumbs up, It's still performing a similar function to a real-world nod or thumbs up, right?
Exactly. It's still conveying a message,
Yeah.
still playing a role in the social dynamics of the interaction.
It's fascinating to think about. And there are all these theories that try to explain how all of this works, right? Like, can we dive into some of those for a moment? I think it'd be really helpful to kind of ground our conversation in some of the theoretical frameworks that researchers are using.
Yeah, definitely. So I think a good place to start is with the social presence theory. This one's been around for a while, since 1976, actually. It was proposed by Short and colleagues. And the basic idea is that the communication medium itself influences how much social presence we actually experience.
Ah, that's interesting. So, different ways of communicating online create different levels of that feeling of being there with others,
Exactly. Think about it like talking on the phone versus having a video chat.
right? You definitely feel more connected on video. You can see the other person's facial expressions and everything.
Right, exactly. And that's because video as a medium can transmit more of those nonverbal cues, those subtle signals that make us feel like we're really with someone. And this theory actually breaks down nonverbal communication into different categories.
Okay, so there are different types of nonverbal cues.
Yeah, they talk about things like nonverbal cues, which would be your gestures, facial expressions,
Yeah.
body language. Then you have vocal nonverbal cues, like changes in volume or tone of voice. And then they also have this broader category of nonverbal cues that include things like personal appearance or how someone presents themselves.
So it's not just about what you say, it's about how you say it and even how you look.
Right. It's all those little things that contribute to the overall impression of the other person. And for them, social presence was really about how much the other person stands out in the interaction, salient they are.
Okay, so a richer way of communicating, one that lets us see and hear more of those nonverbal cues, should, in theory at least, lead to a stronger sense of social presence.
Yeah, that's the idea. The more information we have about the other person, the more real they feel to us, the more present they feel.
Makes sense. What about some of the other theories?
So another interesting one is the media equation theory. This one came about in 1996 by Reeves and Nass. And this theory has a really, I think, kind of funny twist to it. It basically suggests that humans, we tend to treat computers and media as if they were real people and places.
Wait, really? So, like, we get mad at our computer when it freezes up, as if it's doing it on purpose to annoy us.
Exactly. Or, we might talk to a voice assistant as if it were a real person,
Yeah.
even though we know it's just a machine. So the idea here is that our interactions in these virtual learning spaces might not be so different from our real-world interactions after all, at least on a psychological level.
That's pretty wild to think about. It really blurs the lines between the virtual and the real.
It does, doesn't it? And then you've got the media richness theory by Daft and Lengel, and this closely relates to the task media fit approach by McGrath and Hollingshead.
Okay, so media richness and task media fit. What are those all about?
These theories are all about matching the richness of the communication method to the complexity of the task at hand. So the richer the media, the more ways to communicate you have, like video, shared screens, in addition to audio, the better suited it is for tackling more complicated tasks.
So if you're just trying to send a quick message, text might be fine, but if you're trying to have a really nuanced discussion or work through a complex problem as a group, you'd probably want to use a richer form of communication, right?
Exactly. It's about using the right tool for the job, basically. Now let's dig into the specific ways we actually communicate in these online learning environments. Obviously, we have the verbal channels like text, chat, and audio.
And even text chat has gotten more more expressive over the years, right? People are always coming up with creative ways to convey tone and emotion through text, like emojis or using bold text or all caps for emphasis.
Yeah, for sure. Those are all attempts to add a bit of that nonverbal flavor to text-based communication. But when we talk about nonverbal signals within CDEs, we're really looking at a few main categories. So some are based on actual movements that are tracked and then reflected in the avatar. Like there are these special gloves you can wear that allow you to control your avatar's hand gestures, making them mirror your own movements.
Oh, wow, that's pretty high tech.
Yeah, it can be. But that's not as common, I guess. What you see more often are those preset signals that users can activate with a click of the mouse or a keyboard shortcut. Things like having your avatar wave or nod or give a thumbs up.
Oh, right. Those are pretty standard in most virtual environments, aren't they?
Yeah, pretty much.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have your avatar's position in the virtual space,
Yeah.
where it's facing,
Mm-hmm.
and what it appears to be looking at. That's usually controlled by the user with the mouse and keyboard.
So, like, if my avatar is turned towards your avatar and looking at you, that's a nonverbal signal of attention, right?
Exactly. It's like saying, hey, I'm listening to you. I'm focused on what you're saying. And some platforms even have what are called liveliness signals. These are subtle animations that are automatically generated, like blinking or breathing, that just make the avatars feel a bit more lifelike, a bit more present.
Oh, I've seen those. It's funny how those little details can really make a difference.
They do, don't they?
Yeah.
And then you have signals that are tied to specific actions within the virtual environment. Like there might be a special gesture to indicate that you're sending a private message to someone, or a signal that shows when someone is typing a message in the text chat.
So there's a whole language of nonverbal communication that's developing in these virtual spaces.
Exactly. And what's really cool is that these CVE interfaces can be really adaptable. They can be customized to suit different learning needs and different ways of collaborating.
Yeah, that makes sense. The nonverbal cues you'd need for a brainstorming session are probably different from what you'd want for a formal presentation or a lecture. Speaking of adapting to learning needs, I know one of the systems that's mentioned in the research is the Videro system. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, Videro is a virtual team room system that's been used quite a bit, especially in European universities and organizations. They use it for teaching, for teamwork, for all sorts of collaborative activities. It's got a ton of features built in, like a slide projector. You can share applications, browse the web together, brainstorm. It even have breakout rooms for smaller group discussions and a virtual language lab.
Wow, it sounds like a really comprehensive virtual learning environment, like a one-stop shop for all things collaborative.
Yeah, it's designed to be a really flexible space.
So what are the avatars like in Videro? What do they look like?
So in Videro, it's not so much about having these elaborate 3D avatars. You usually see avatars represented as icons with name tags, and they're typically arranged around a virtual table, kind of like a virtual meeting room.
Okay, so it's a more simplified visual representation.
Yeah, it's more about functionality than fancy graphics.
Right, and the tutor or facilitator, they have a lot of control over how this virtual room is set up, right?
Oh, absolutely. They can decide on the layout of the room, how many seats are at the table, how the name tags are displayed, even things like designating a chair for a co-tutor. They can also prepare those separate virtual rooms for the breakout groups, so everything's ready to go when it's time for smaller group discussions.
So it's like they can really tailor the environment to fit the specific learning activity. What about the ways people communicate within Videro? What options do they have?
Well, they have audio communication, so that can be voice over IP or even a regular phone conference option. They also have a text chat feature, and messages appear in word balloons next to the avatars, which is kind of cool. And then they have those preset gestures we were talking about, like the thumbs up and the applause. And there's also this virtual microphone feature, which is kind of interesting.
A virtual microphone, what's that all about?
So it's basically a way to manage the audio communication, to help structure the conversation. Users can signal that they want to speak, and then the microphone can be passed around, or it can be controlled by the tutor.
Oh, I see. So it's like a way to create a more orderly flow of conversation, especially if you have a larger group.
Exactly. It prevents people from talking over each other and ensures everyone gets a chance to speak.
Hmm.
But here's where it gets even more interesting. Videro also has this option for video, so users can turn on their webcams and their live video feed will appear in their spot at the virtual table.
Oh, okay. So they have the option to make it more visually rich, more like a real-world video conference.
Right. And this really shows how both the instructor and the learners can adapt the system based on how much social presence they feel is needed. Like, the instructor might encourage video for a more personal touch, or if they're doing an activity that really benefits from seeing each other's facial expressions. And then the learners can decide if they want to use video or not.
So there's flexibility built into the system. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It acknowledges that different people might have different preferences and different levels of comfort with being visible, I guess.
Okay, let's go back to this core idea of social presence. We've touched on some ways to define it, but can we unpack that a bit more? Like, how is social presence actually understood, especially in the context of these virtual environments where we're interacting through avatars?
Sure. So as we mentioned earlier, the concept of social presence, it kind of originated in the world of telecommunications. Back in the 70s, Short and his colleagues, they viewed social presence as that overall feeling we get from all those cues that are present in a face-to-face interaction. But when we move to these virtual environments, the definitions, they start to evolve a little bit.
So how did those definitions change? Well, for instance, Heater, she defines social presence as the extent to which other beings, whether they're real people or synthetic agents, seem to exist and react within the virtual environment. She really emphasized that feeling of interaction, like you're not just observing these other beings, you're actually engaging with them. They're responding to you.
So it's not just about seeing other avatars, it's about feeling like they're actually acknowledging you, responding to your actions, that sort of thing.
Exactly. It's that two-way street, that sense of reciprocity that's really important.
Okay, so that's Heater's perspective.
Right. Then you have Salinas and Blaskovich, and they offer a slightly different but related view. They specifically focus on that connection between people in these virtual spaces. They define social presence as the feeling of being with another person who is physically located somewhere else. It's that sense of sharing a virtual space together, even though you're not physically in the same room. And this is actually the definition that's mainly used in the research we're discussing today.
Okay, so it's that feeling of we're in this together, even though we're miles apart. And avatars are digital representations in these environments. They're really central to creating that feeling, aren't they?
Absolutely. I mean, as Taylor put it, bodies root us and make us present to ourselves and to others. Avatars provide that visual anchor. They give us something to focus on, something to connect with.
And they serve a couple of main purposes, right?
Right. So the first one is identification. Avatars help us identify who's who in the virtual environment. They can signal things like the user's name, their role in the group, maybe their status, or even their group membership, depending on how the avatar is designed.
Right, so it's like a quick visual cue that tells you something about the person behind the avatar.
Exactly. And then the second purpose, which is particularly relevant to our conversation today, is interaction support. Avatars actually help us interact with each other more effectively in these virtual spaces.
Interaction support. So what does that look like in practice?
Well, it breaks down into two main things. First, you have group awareness information. This refers to the ways in which avatars can visually display what other people in the group are doing, like where they're looking, what they're interacting with, that sort of thing. Gutwin and his team, they did a lot of research on this.
Oh, right. I remember reading some of their work. It's like those little visual cues that give you a sense of what others are focused on, even if you can't see their faces or hear their voices.
Exactly. And then the second aspect of interaction support is communication cues. These are the cues that are specifically tied to the act of communicating. Think back to those speech bubbles for text chat or visual cues that indicate who's speaking in an audio conversation, like an avatar's mouth moving or a little sound wave icon next to their name.
So the avatar isn't just a static image, it's actively providing information that helps us connect and communicate more effectively.
Right, it's adding that social layer to the interaction.
And the idea we've been talking about is that by providing these digital nonverbal signals through avatars, we can actually increase that feeling of social presence, that feeling of being there with others. And that can have a positive impact on online learning interactions, especially when it comes to things like taking turns in a conversation or giving each other feedback.
That's the general hypothesis, yeah. Now let's shift gears a little bit and look at what the research actually tells us. There were some really interesting early studies that kind of gave us a first glimpse into how people were actually using these nonverbal signals in real online interactions.
Yeah, the Becker and Mark study, for example, they looked at how people were behaving in active worlds and online traveler, right? What did they find?
Yeah. So they observed that those preset nonverbal signals like waving, jumping, dancing, or using those pre-programmed facial expressions, they were actually used quite rarely.
Oh, really? That's surprising. I would have thought those would be more popular.
Yeah, it seems people preferred to express themselves through text-based emoticons, through audio cues like laughter, or even just by moving their avatars around the virtual space. And one thing they noticed, which kind of echoes what we were talking about earlier, is that managing turn-taking, figuring out who's going to speak next, seemed to be a bit of a challenge in those environments.
So it seems like just having those nonverbal signals available doesn't necessarily guarantee that people will use them frequently or that it will solve all the communication challenges.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's not a magic bullet. What about the Nilsson study? You mentioned that one earlier, too. They were also looking at active worlds, right?
Yeah, they were. Did they find something similar?
They did, actually. They also found that people tended to use the nonverbal signals more when they were first getting familiar with the environment, but then their usage dropped off over time. And they also agreed that managing turn-taking could be a bit tricky sometimes.
So it's almost like once people get comfortable with the environment, they rely less on those explicit nonverbal cues. Maybe they develop other ways of communicating those things.
Yeah, it's possible they start to rely more on the nuances of text chat or audio communication to convey those subtle social cues.
Makes sense. But there were other studies, more qualitative ones, that actually highlighted the value of some of those nonverbal signals, right? Like
Yeah.
the ones by Anderson and Guy VM.
Exactly. So those studies found that the raise hand gesture, in particular, was used quite frequently and was actually considered quite helpful for managing turn taking. People really liked having that visual cue that clearly signaled their intention to speak.
So it seems like certain types of nonverbal signals, especially those that are very clearly tied to the flow of interaction, can be really valuable.
Yeah, especially when they help to reduce ambiguity and make the communication more efficient.
Right. And then we have your own exploratory studies in those early versions of the Vitero system. What did your research show?
So our first study was with groups of employees, and we found that on average, people were using about 0.32 nonverbal signals per minute for each avatar. The thumb up signal and the arrow tool, which was used for pointing at things on the shared screen, those were the most popular. And people said they were mainly using these to express agreement, to highlight important information, that sort of thing. And importantly, they generally felt like the meetings were successful and that they were able to communicate effectively using the tools that were available.
So even a relatively low usage of these signals could still have a positive effect on how well people felt they could communicate and collaborate.
Right, exactly. It's not necessarily about the quantity, but more about how those signals are integrated into the overall communication flow.
And then you did a second study with university students, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And I remember reading that the usage of those nonverbal signals was much higher in that study.
It was quite a bit higher. We saw an average of almost 6 nonverbal signals being used per minute per group. Plus, they were also using the text chat quite a bit, with an average of about 1 text chat message per minute.
Wow, so they were really making use of those communication tools?
They were. And the thumb up, the applause, and the thumb down signals, those were particularly popular. And overall, the students reported feeling pretty positive about the online sessions, the text chat, and the nonverbal signals. They felt like those tools helped them communicate conveniently and effectively.
So they were happy with the experience overall.
Yeah, they were. They specifically mentioned the thumb up, thumb down, and hand raising signals as being particularly important for their interactions.
It's interesting that they highlighted hand raising, even though it wasn't used as often as those approval and disapproval signals. It probably speaks to its specific function in managing turn taking.
Right. It's like it has this clear purpose, even if it's not used as frequently. We also found that the students were generally happy using avatars, and they actually preferred using a photo of themselves as their avatar over having live video.
Oh, that's interesting. So even a simple photo was enough to create that sense of personal representation.
It seems so, yeah. And in terms of social presence, they reported feeling a moderate sense of presence during the sessions. And one interesting finding was that they actually felt less nervous giving presentations in Vitero compared to presenting in person, although that did vary from person to person. Some people are just naturally more comfortable speaking in front of others.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like that virtual barrier might provide a bit of a buffer for those who get stage fright, but they did mention some drawbacks, right?
They did. One thing they mentioned was missing the full range of nonverbal feedback they would normally get from an audience in a face-to-face setting. It made it a bit harder for them to gauge if people were paying attention or if they were understanding the material.
Right. It's like you lose some of that subtle feedback you get from facial expressions and body language.
Exactly. But overall, they appreciated and used the different ways to communicate, especially for those core functions of managing turns, giving feedback, and guiding the learning process.
So it seems like those Vitero studies, they suggest that when you have a set of nonverbal signals that are specifically designed for learning interactions, people do actually use them and they find them helpful, even if they don't fully replicate all the nuances of face-to-face nonverbal communication. Okay, so that's a good overview of some of those early studies. Now, let's delve into some of the experimental studies where researchers were really trying to tease apart the effects of different ways representing users and different communication methods.
Yeah, these studies offer some really interesting and sometimes even surprising findings.
Okay, give us some examples. What did they find?
Well, one study that really stood out was by Calais and Anderson. They compared using high-quality video feeds of the participants with using very basic graphical avatars that only showed the person's gender and name.
Oh, that's a stark contrast.
It is. And what they found was that there were fewer interruptions when people were using video.
So video led to a more orderly conversation, which makes sense.
Yeah, it suggests that video does play a role in structuring the interaction. But here's the surprising part. They didn't find any significant difference in how much social presence people felt between the two conditions.
Wait, really? Even with those very basic avatars, people felt just as present as they did when they could see each other on video.
That's what they found, yeah. And their eye tracking data even showed that people were still looking at those very simple avatars, even though they weren't very visually detailed.
That's wild. It really challenges the assumption that you need these highly realistic avatars to create a sense of social presence. It makes you wonder if even those basic visual representations are enough to trigger that fundamental social connection.
It does, doesn't it? It suggests that maybe there's something more to it than just visual realism.
Right. And then there was the Selena study that compared text chat, audio conferencing, and video conferencing within a CVE that used human-like avatars. What did they find?
So in that study, the group that was only using text chat, they took longer to make a decision on a task they were given, and they also reported feeling less social presence, which isn't too surprising. Text chat just doesn't have that same level of richness.
Right. But what about the audio and video conditions?
So here's the thing. There was no significant difference in social presence between the groups that used audio and those that use video within the CVE.
So adding video to the audio didn't actually make people feel any more present?
Not in that particular context, no.
Okay.
And Salinas suggested that maybe the 3D environment itself, with its visuals and the ability to interact with the environment, maybe that was contributing to the feeling of presence in a way that reduced the need for full video.
So it's almost like the environment itself is a form of nonverbal communication, a way of creating shared context and a sense of shared space.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to think about it.
Okay, so we've got the Clays and Anderson study, the Salinas study. What other experimental studies stand out?
Another interesting one is by Bente and colleagues. They also compared different communication methods, including text chat, audio video, and an avatar-only condition. And they found that text chat led to significantly lower feelings of intimacy and spatial co-presence compared to all the other conditions.
Spatial co-presence, that's that feeling of sharing the same space, right?
Exactly. And that makes sense, right? Text chat, it's just not as good at creating that sense of shared physicality. But here's the thing. They didn't actually find any differences in behavioral contingency or social attentiveness across those conditions.
Behavioral contingency, what does that mean in this context?
It refers to how much people are responding to each other's actions. Like, if one person does something, does the other person react in a way that's appropriate to the situation? So basically, even though people might have felt less close or less like they were sharing the same space when they were using text chat, they were still responding to each other and paying attention to each other's actions.
So it's like different aspects of social presence might be affected differently depending on how we're communicating.
What about the Garau study? That one looked at eye gaze specifically, right?
Yeah, that one's fascinating. So they compared using video, audio only, and two different avatar conditions. One where the avatar's gaze was linked to who was speaking, so it would actually look at the person who was talking, and one where the gaze was random.
Oh, that's a clever manipulation.
It is. And not surprisingly, participants preferred using video and the avatar with the informed gaze. The informed gaze condition was also rated more favorably than the random gaze and audio-only conditions. And here's another interesting finding. There wasn't a significant difference between the informed gaze avatar and video in terms of how involved people felt in the conversation and how similar the experience felt to a real face-to-face conversation.
So just that one nonverbal cue, the gaze being directed at the speaker, was enough to create a similar level of involvement and realism as video.
It seems so, yeah. But video did score higher in overall social presence. Okay, so video still has an edge in terms of creating that overall feeling of being there with others.
Yeah, but the key takeaway from this study is that even a single nonverbal cue like gaze, especially when it's linked to the conversational flow, it can significantly improve how we perceive the communication.
It makes sense, right? If you know someone is looking at you when you're speaking, even if it's just an avatar, it creates a stronger sense of connection, a stronger sense of being heard. It's like those early studies on eye contact. They found that even brief moments of eye contact can increase feelings of liking and trust. So it's not surprising that this would translate into the virtual world as well.
Exactly. And this finding is consistent with some of the research that's been done on eye gaze in those more immersive CVEs, where people are using head-mounted displays. So it seems like this principle of gaze direction communication being a powerful nonverbal cue, it holds true across different types of virtual environments.
That's really interesting. Okay, finally, I know you did some experiments yourself that looked at how the availability of those nonverbal signals impacted social presence in Vitero. What did you find?
Right. So in our experiments, we found that audio was the communication method that people used most frequently, followed by the nonverbal signals. And those nonverbal signals were used more than text chat, which suggests that those signals were relatively easy to use and they didn't interrupt the flow of speech as much as typing did.
So people liked having those nonverbal options available.
They did, yeah. But here's a really important point, and it kind of gets back to what we were discussing earlier about how it's not a simple equation. Simply having those nonverbal signals available did not actually lead to a stronger feeling of social presence.
Yeah.